The neighborhood had always been quiet on the surface, yet beneath its manicured lawns and identical rows of beige houses, there was a constant hum of tension. Rules dictated everything. Here what color a door could be painted, how tall a tree could grow, even the placement of trash bins. The Homeowners Association prided itself on being the invisible hand that molded the community into a picture-perfect postcard. But for those who stepped out of line, the HOA became something far darker. A watchdog, a bully, and, in many cases, a destroyer of livelihoods. I had lived here long enough to know their power, but I had also lived long enough to know something the others didn't he? Power is only real until someone reminds you where it actually comes from. It started with a letter. A single piece of paper slipped into my mailbox, stamped with the HOAS seal at the top. The words were as sharp as a blade disguised in bureaucratic politeness. Cease operations immediately, or face permanent expulsion from the neighborhood. They claimed my business was in violation of community standards, though they never defined what those standards actually were. To them, my small Operation Ann office, set up in the spare room of my house, was somehow a threat to their vision of suburban perfection. But this was no ordinary business. It wasn't landscaping, tutoring, or even an online store. I was the tax collector for this county. Every assessment, every fine, every dollar that moved through official channels eventually landed on my desk. And while the HOA strutted around pretending they held dominion over these streets, they had forgotten a simple truth. Their authority was only as strong as the paper trail I controlled. The notice ended with a mocking line, a smug assertion that I would never operate in this neighborhood again. They believed their threats carried weight. They laughed, picturing me scrambling to dismantle my desk, box up my files, and shut down my operations like some defeated trespasser. What they didn't realize was that their own empire was built on sand, and I had the tide at my fingertips. Still, I played the part of the silent resident. Outwardly, I said nothing. I allowed them their little victory dance, allowed the smug board members to whisper about how they had finally cornered me. But inside, the fire was already burning. They had declared war on the very system that allowed them to exist. They had made me their enemy. Without realizing, I was the one who processed the records that validated their collections. And this was the kind of war that wasn't fought with noise or fists. It was fought with silence, with numbers, with the slow turning of bureaucratic gears. If the HOA wanted to remind me of my place, I would remind them of theirs. The days following the letter were filled with small performances. The HOA board members strutted around, inspecting properties, handing out fines for trivialities. A lawn, half an inch too tall. A garbage bin placed 2 minutes too early. A child's bike left on a porch. They spoke loudly enough for neighbors to hear, ensuring everyone knew they were in control. People nodded in fear, eager to avoid their gaze. But when those fines were processed, when the payments were logged, it was my name they passed through first. And I began to notice a pattern one I could exploit. The days that followed were filled with an almost eerie calm. The HOA believed the threat had silenced me, and the smugness of their board members grew louder with every passing hour. Neighbors whispered about how justice had been served, how the board had protected the community from an eyesore they didn't even understand. But while they congratulated themselves, I watched, I listened, and I prepared. The truth is, power rarely collapses in one dramatic moment. It erodes, grain by grain, until the structure above crumbles under its own weight. That's how HOAs work too. They thrived on intimidation, on making residents feel like they had no choice but to comply. But they also thrived on money endless, fines, fees, and dues. And money, as I knew better than anyone else, leaves a trail that cannot be ignored. Each board member had a weakness buried in their files, and those files passed through my hands. Property tax delinquencies, overdue accounts, quiet liens placed against their homes when they thought no one was looking, Some had let their debts pile up for years, hidden behind the association's curtain of authority. They fined residents hundreds of dollars for weeds growing too tall, while their own unpaid property taxes stretched into the thousands. It was almost laughable. The same people who threatened to ban my business had no idea that their own survival depended on the very system they were mocking. And I decided I wouldn't just expose them. I would let their own greed and arrogance tighten the noose. The first move was subtle. I began sending out formal reminders. Not to everyone, just to the board members themselves. Notices about their unpaid balances. Letters stamped with official insignia. Warnings that further inaction would lead to escalation. I knew the timelines by heart. They had 30 days before the situation grew serious, 60 before penalties compounded, 90 before they faced consequences that couldn't be brushed aside with HOA meetings or self-important speeches. I sent the letters, knowing full well how they would react. At first, they would laugh it off, thinking they were immune. But each letter was a reminder that the system was watching, that the walls they had built around themselves weren't as impenetrable as they thought. Meanwhile, their behavior toward the neighborhood grew worse. They fined a single mother for hanging laundry in her backyard. They ticketed a retiree for planting flowers that clashed with the approved color palette. They even issued warnings to families with children, citing noise violations, because kids dared to ride bikes down the sidewalk. Every petty act added to their mountain of arrogance sand. Every petty act made their downfall taste sweeter. Neighbors grew restless. Fear turned into quiet resentment. Though most were too afraid to speak, I could see it in their eyes at community gatherings, in the hushed conversations the HOA board had gone too far, but no one knew what to do. No one but me. The second move was timing. I waited until their arrogance peaked, until they strutted through the streets like kings surveying their kingdom. Then, quietly, I set the next stage in motion. Certain files were flagged for further review, pushed to the top of official queues. The delinquencies weren't hidden anymore. They were spotlighted. And once spotlighted, the machine began turning faster. Summons were issued. Notices of impending liens arrived at their doorsteps. And with every knock of official correspondence, the cracks in their armor widened. They tried to ignore it at first, brushing off the warnings as if they were meaningless. But when you're used to being the one issuing fines, receiving them cuts deeper. Their laughter faltered. Their meetings grew tense. Whispers spread among the board members about errors and misunderstandings. They insisted it was all a clerical issue, a mistake that would soon be resolved. But I knew better, and so did the system. The irony wasn't lost on me. They had told me I would never operate in this neighborhood again. Yet, here I was, quietly tightening the threads that bound their fates. Every document they mocked, every file they disregarded, it was all under my control. They had poked the bear, and now they were learning what it meant to live in its shadow. Still, I didn't celebrate. Not yet, because I knew people like this didn't crumble. They would resist, claw, and fight until the very end. And when backed into a corner, they would lash out at anyone around them. That was the danger. Their pride made them blind, but their fear would make them reckless. The real question wasn't whether they would fall, it was how much damage they would cause on the way down. And as I filed the last set of notices that week, I've realized something chilling. The HOA board wasn't going to take this lying down. They had the arrogance of rulers and the desperation of gamblers on their last bet. And desperate rulers can be dangerous. The calm was breaking. I could feel the storm coming. The cracks in the HOA board's confidence were beginning to show, but arrogance never dies quietly. When the official notices started stacking at their doorsteps, they did not admit defeat. Instead, they doubled down. It was as if their pride demanded they prove to the neighborhood that they were still in control, no matter how fragile their foundations had become. The retaliation began subtly, like the sting of a mosquito that you almost don't notice until the itch becomes unbearable. My property was suddenly under inspection. HOA representatives walked past my house more than usual, clipboards in hand, pointing at my lawn, my shutters, even the mailbox. They searched for flaws, desperate to find ammunition. And soon enough, the letters came. Violation notices. One after another. The grass, they said, was not maintained to the community standard. My garbage bin, they claimed, was visible from the street. A single decorative plant on my porch was not an approved species. Each notice came with a fine, and each fine was accompanied by the thinly veiled satisfaction of a board trying to prove they were still in charge. They believed they were drowning me in paperwork, bearing me under their authority. But what they didn't understand was that every piece of paper they issued traveled a road that crossed my desk. Every fine, every fee, every manufactured violation, it all funneled back to the very office I controlled, and with every attempt to bury me, they handed me more proof of their corruption. Neighbors noticed, too. They watched as the board circled my house like vultures, issuing violations for things most residents did every day. The hypocrisy was obvious, though no one dared say it aloud. Fear kept their mouths shut, but their eyes told the story. The board had gone too far, and everyone knew it. But the board wasn't finished. They escalated! Suddenly, whispers began to spread through the community. Rumors that I was a troublemaker, that I was abusing my position. It was classic politics character, assassination, in place of accountability. They wanted the neighborhood to turn against me, to isolate me, so I would have no support when their next moves came. The irony, of course, was delicious. While they tried to paint me as corrupt, their own debts and violations piled higher. Some of their properties were now flagged for liens. One board member faced the possibility of foreclosure if their delinquency continued. Another had unpaid penalties so steep they dwarfed the fines they handed out to residents. Yet still, they strutted at meetings, voices sharp with authority, as if nothing could touch them. I knew better. They were cornered animals, now dangerous, desperate, and blind to their own downfall. The retaliation reached its peak when I received a letter, unlike the others. This one was bold, even reckless. It declared that the HOA board had voted to suspend my residency privileges within the neighborhood. They claimed I could no longer use the community amenities, attend meetings, or even park my car on the street. It was a ridiculous overreach, a desperate attempt to flex authority they did not legally possess. And that was their fatal mistake. Up until now, I had let them play their games. I had let them dance in the illusion of power, waiting for the system to strip them bare. But by crossing into territory they had no right to touch, they had given me the weapon I needed. That letter was not just arrogance, it was illegality in the hands of the tax collector was the sharpest blade of all. I didn't confront them. I didn't need to. Instead, I documented everything. The violations, the fines, the harassment, the unlawful suspension. I built a file so thick it could crush the board in one decisive blow. And when the time was right, I knew exactly where to place each writ into the hands of the officials who oversaw associations like this. But as I compiled the evidence, one thought haunted me. How much more damage would they cause before the hammer fell? Because desperate rulers do not surrender. They drag others down with them. And I knew with a cold certainty that the board was far from finished. The storm wasn't coming anymore. It was here. When power begins to slip, those who cling to it often squeeze harder, unaware that the tighter their grip, the faster it crumbles. That was the HOA board, now once untouchable, now stumbling under the weight of their own hubris. Their empire of control was starting to fracture, and the neighborhood could see it. The first sign came quietly, almost hidden beneath their usual theatrics. A lien was placed on one of the board members' homes. It wasn't announced, of course. These things never were, but word travels fast in a small community. Neighbors whispered about it at the mailbox, their voices hushed but tinged with satisfaction. The very people who fined them for trivial violations were now unable to keep their own financial house in order. Soon, more cracks followed. Notices piled up, summons were delivered, and one by one, the board members began facing consequences they had long believed themselves immune from. Their once confident strut turned into anxious glances. Their laughter in meetings was replaced with arguments and raised voices. The board was no longer a united front, it was a collection of cornered egos, each one scrambling to protect themselves. And the residents noticed the fear that once silenced them began to fade. They saw the vulnerability of their oppressors, and for the first time, they allowed themselves to imagine a neighborhood without the tyranny of endless fines and harassment. Quiet conversations turned bolder. Complaints that had once been whispered in private now echoed openly across driveways. The HOA board had always relied on fear to keep order, but fear was a currency they were quickly running out of. Still, arrogance is not so easily extinguished. Instead of backing down, the board tried to assert control with louder, harsher measures. They increased inspections. They doubled fines. They stormed through the streets with clipboards, desperate to remind everyone that they were still in charge. But their desperation only made their weakness more obvious. Residents began to push back, some refusing to pay, others openly mocking the absurdity of the violations. The authority of the HOA was no longer absolute, it was a joke. And as their power slipped, so did their unity. At one board meeting, tension boiled over. The once polished group of enforcers now bickered openly in front of residents, accusing one another of incompetence, betrayal, even sabotage. Their polished masks had cracked, and beneath them lay nothing but chaos. For me, it was confirmation. The system was working exactly as I knew it would. The documents, the notices, the careful steps I had taken, all of it was bearing fruit. I didn't need to raise my voice. Didn't need to expose myself. The HOA board was destroying itself from the inside, fueled by arrogance, fear, and the simple truth that they were not above the rules they forced upon others. But I also knew the most dangerous moment was approaching. When rulers see their kingdom falling, they don't quietly walk away. They lash out. They drag down whoever they can reach in a last attempt to salvage their pride. And I could feel that moment drawing closer. The letter I had received, the one suspending my residency privileges, had been reckless, but it was also telling. It revealed their desperation, their willingness to cross legal lines when intimidation no longer worked. And desperate people rarely stop at one mistake. The residents didn't know it yet, but the board's time was almost up. Investigations were already in motion. Files already in the hands of officials who could dismantle the HOAS authority piece by piece. It was only a matter of time before the neighborhood saw the empire collapse. But as I sat in my office, watching the glow of the desk lamp reflect off the growing stack of evidence, I couldn't shake the unease. The HOA board wasn't finished not yet. And if history had taught me anything, it was that people who feel their throne slipping beneath them will burn everything down before they let go. The neighborhood was about to witness the full desperation of a collapsing regime. And I was ready. When power slips beyond repair, pride becomes poison. The HOA board, once smug in their control, was now cornered and, like all cornered predators, they struck with reckless ferocity. The retaliation began with an almost laughable attempt at intimidation. Anonymous letters appeared in my mailbox, filled with threats scribbled in shaky handwriting. They accused me of ruining the community, warning that if I didn't stop, I'd regret it. The irony was sharp. The people who prided themselves on formal notices and official seals had been reduced to cowardly scraps of paper. But the intent was clear. They were no longer just fighting to maintain authority. They were fighting for survival. Next came the smear campaign. Flyers appeared, taped to streetlights, stuffed into doorways, slipped beneath windshield wipers. They bore accusations that I was corrupt, that I was using my position as tax collector to persecute innocent board members. They claimed I was abusing my power, weaponizing the system for personal vendettas. The accusations were bold, but they lacked the one thing I had in abundance: proof. Neighbors read the flyers, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others quietly laughing at the absurdity. After all, everyone in the neighborhood had felt the sting of the HOA's heavy hand. The idea that the board members were innocent victims rang hollow. The smear campaign didn't rally support, it exposed their desperation. But still, they didn't stop. At the next HOA meeting, the tension exploded. What was once a choreographed display of authority became chaos. Residents, emboldened by the board's unraveling, stood up and demanded answers. They asked why fines were being doubled, why amenities were closed, why rumors about liens and foreclosures surrounded the very people in charge. The board tried to maintain control, but their voices cracked under the weight of questions they could not answer. They pointed fingers at one another, blaming clerical errors and mismanagement. For the first time, the residents weren't afraid, they were angry. And anger spread quickly. In their desperation, the board made one final, catastrophic mistake. They attempted to push through an emergency amendment that would give them broader powers authority to bypass certain financial reviews, authority to issue liens directly, authority to silence dissent within the community. It was their last grasp at control, a blatant power grab meant to shield themselves from the consequences closing in. But it backfired spectacularly. The residents erupted. The amendment was shouted down before it could even be voted on. People stormed out of the meeting in disgust, their loyalty to the board gone forever. For years, the HOA had ruled through fear, but in that moment, the fear shifted. It was no longer the residents who trembled, it was the board. Behind the scenes, the system had already caught up with them. Investigations were underway. Liens were enforced, and one board member received a formal notice of foreclosure proceedings. Their empire was collapsing, not in silence, but in full view of the community they had once lorded over. And as I watched it all unfold, I realized something. They had done most of the work for me. I had simply pulled the first thread. They had unraveled the rest with their own arrogance, their own greed, their own inability to see that the rules they enforced applied to them too. But even in ruin, I knew they wouldn't go quietly. There was still one final act in this drama, one last desperate attempt waiting to unfold. The HOA board might have been broken, but pride doesn't fade overnight, and desperate rulers, as history had shown, time and again, will cling to the throne, even as it burns to ash beneath them. The neighborhood was standing at the edge of change. The old order was dying. And in its final breaths, I knew the HOA board would strike one last time. The only question left was how and who they would try to take down with them. The end didn't come with a whisper, it came with a crash. 4 weeks. The HOA board had been clawing at the walls of their crumbling empire, lashing out at residents, accusing me of corruption, and grasping at powers they no longer had. But pride is a fragile shield, and when it breaks, there is nothing left to hide behind. The first domino fell when foreclosure notices became public record. One board member, once the loudest voice at meetings, the one who had sworn I would never operate in this neighborhood again, was now facing the loss of their own home. It was poetic. The enforcer of fines, the wielder of threats, reduced to a desperate homeowner fighting to keep their roof. Neighbors who had once bowed their heads in fear now spoke openly about the hypocrisy. Respect had turned into ridicule. The second domino came with an investigation. State officials, prompted by the thick file of evidence I had quietly passed along, launched a formal review into the HOA's practices. The illegal suspension letters, the bogus fines, the smear covenant was all documented, all undeniable. Their arrogance had left a paper trail, and that trail led directly to their downfall. Residents, once silenced by fear, now stood tall at community gatherings. They no longer whispered, they shouted. They demanded resignations, demanded transparency, demanded an end to the tyranny that had ruled their lives for so long. The board tried to fight back, tried to cling to their authority, but their voices were drowned out by the collective roar of a community that had finally found its strength. And then, at the final HOA meeting, the collapse came. The room was packed, every chair filled, neighbors lining the walls, the air thick with tension. The board sat at the front, their once confident posture now sagging under the weight of defeat. Papers shook in their hands, voices faltered as they tried to justify the But there was no saving face! The residents had seen too much, suffered too long, and the truth had finally stripped the board bare. One by one, the resignations were forced. The president stepped down amid the treasurer, buried under delinquent taxes, walked out in silence. The remaining members, faced with the threat of legal consequences, scattered like rats abandoning a sinking ship. The HOA, once a towering force of control, collapsed in a single night. When it was over, the room was silent. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of relief. The neighborhood had been freed, not by rebellion in the streets, but by the slow turning of the wheels of truth and accountability. I didn't gloat. There was no need. My role had never been to fight them openly. My role had been to remind the neighborhood that no one is above the rules, not even those who enforce them. In the days that followed, change swept through the community. New leadership was chosen, this time made up of residents who understood that the HOA existed to serve, not to rule. The endless fines stopped. The petty inspections faded. For the first time in years, neighbors felt like they actually owned their homes again. And as for Mitha's so-called business they had tried to ban, it continued, untouched, stronger than ever. Because in the end, every dollar they had wielded as a weapon had always passed through me first. They had forgotten that truth. They had mistaken authority for power. And in doing so, they had destroyed themselves. The HOA board had laughed once, telling me I would never operate in this neighborhood again. But as I sat on my porch, in the calm of a quiet evening, watching children ride their bikes down the street without fear of a clipboard-toting enforcer, I couldn't help but smile at the irony. Because in the end, I hadn't just operated, I had outlasted them. And they would never operate here again. The end.